Good afternoon, everybody. Excuse me. This slide is a really important slide. And what it says is that this isn't all about high-risk buildings. And it's really, really important to understand. The Building Safety Act will do a number of things. It's going to modify, and has already started to modify, the Building Act. And through that, these titles of the legislation, I have it on reasonable authority that they're accurate, although as I've learned in this game that everything changes, so they may be different. But there will be regulations that will cover changes to building control. And that relates to competence and other requirements relating to building control, the building control profession. Perhaps the most significant is the changes to the building regulations that will bring in duty holders and competence. And then, as the third piece of that, is regulations that sit on top of the duty holder and competence requirements, which will apply to all work to which the building regulations apply, are the gateways, which are apply to higher risk buildings. And then sitting above that are the duties relating to the occupation of high risk buildings. So this really is not all about high risk buildings. Part 3 of the Act, which I think is the bit that the construction industry are going to be affected by, makes those 3 changes to building control authorities, building regulation, changes to building regulations for all building work to which the building regulations apply, and then there's that third aspect is building regulations for high risk buildings. So if you look at the similar diagram to the first one, but taken in a slightly different way. I suppose the additional piece is that you will have the construction products regulations that will clearly affect all building regulation compliance work, and you will have this overarching requirement to be competent to deliver compliance against the building regulations. And there will be key duty holders. So the accountability under the building regulations will change significantly. And the building regulations are being amended in 2 ways. One is that the functional requirements will probably change. And then most significantly, the procedural requirements will change as well. So there are going to be some new duty holders. They look like CDM, and that's really quite deliberate. This is what happens here is in addition to CDM. We have Tim Galloway speaking later, and he will is far more better placed than I would tell you what the policy intention is. But to the best of my knowledge, is that the intention is these roles will be delivered, or the policy intention is they'll be delivered by the same organization, but they require different skills. So these duty holders are in relationship to compliance with the building regulations. So client, principal designer, unfortunately the name is the same as principal designer under CDM. They are 2 different roles, ideally carried out by the same person. Designers, principal contractors, and contractors. And on a domestic level, similar to CDM. And in fact, a lot about these new legislation, which we've seen draft legislation. We've had the consultation, and most of what I'm talking about is based upon those 2 bits of information. We haven't seen the regulations yet. If a domestic client fails to make appointments, then the principal designer is the designer in control of the design phase of the work. I'm just going to quickly look at my next slide. The principal designer I haven't gone into much detail, well, any detail as to what that looks like. But logically, it has to be, if you have contractual responsibility for building regulations compliance, logically it has to be that same person, and that generally will fall within the role of the lead designer. And it's that person who coordinates the whole thing. But everybody has duties. They have duties to be competent, and they have duties to comply with the building regulations, and there are penalties for failure. Clients' duties, again, I keep repeating, it looks very like the CDM regulations, and it's very deliberate. Clients will have to make suitable arrangements to ensure that design work and building work can be completed in accordance with the building regulations. Clients must appoint the right people, the right competencies, and ensure that those they have got the right systems in place to ensure compliance with the building regulations. I'd say we've got those two new duty holders, principal designer and principal contractor. These are very skills roles and require an understanding of the building regulations in such a way that they can plan, manage and monitor the design phase or the construction phase to ensure that whatever's built would comply with the building regulations. In fact, all duties holders are going to need to plan, manage and monitor their work, and that involves a significant change in the way you look at what you do. Maybe less for structural engineers than other designers, but you still need to work out how you're going to evidence, and a lot of this is relating to how do you evidence to be able to communicate to others, how do you evidence to protect yourself that what you've done complies with the building regulation. That is particularly significant where you have change of design responsibilities. There's this duty to cooperate with other duty holders. And then absolutely sitting at the core of that is skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours, and organisational capability. Sorry, I'm just going to follow on that. Skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours. Behaviours is important. Behaviours is a key requirement that you do not act outside. So there's going to be a legal duty not to act outside your competence. So if you've never worked on a high-risk building, if you've never worked on well, I suppose the hospital, for another want of a better word, or another, if you've never worked on those, then you, without additional training or without appropriate supervision, you shouldn't put yourself forward for that work. Organizational capability is a combination of it's the arrangements and the procedures for making sure that as an organization you have skills, knowledge and behaviors across the business to deliver your undertaking. So it's a combination of those overarching procedures to make sure that everybody who works for you, be that an employee or a contractor, if you procure other work, then how do you determine they are either have the organizational capability and skills, knowledge, experience? There's a lot to think about, and this all relates to compliance with the building regulations. You've then got those additional duties that relate to higher risk buildings. The definition for part 3, which relates to, as I said, building work undertaken in accordance with the building regulations, is different to part 4, which relates to the management of occupied buildings. So it's a building in England that is 18 meters and has at least 7 stories, and is a description specified in the regulations. And we now have draft secondary legislation that further clarifies what that description is, and then that must have at least 2 residential units. For occupation, care homes and hospitals don't fall within it, but within construction, it's buildings containing at least 2 residential units, and also care homes and hospitals. You've probably heard a little bit about high-risk buildings, because that seems to be where the focus has been, as this is what it's all about. And as I say, I don't think it's all about that. I think it's all about the changes to the building regulations that apply to everybody who designs in accordance with the building regulations. So there can be 3 gateways, or there is 1 gateway already, which is planning gateway 1, which is the fire statement. Gateway 2, before the building work starts, and then gateway 3 is when the building work is completed. Gateway 1 requires a fire statement. There has been some, I understand, problems with people producing an appropriate fire statement that's acceptable to the regulator. I think that's slowly changing, but I saw something quoted the other day, is, you know, this building regulation compliance really needs to start back at that early planning stage. Gateway 2 is a stop-go. It requires a large amount of information to be available before work starts. There will be, or it is suggested that there will be, it's proposed that there will be a stage process where work up to a particular stage, maybe substructure, will be acceptable, and then the information following. But as I say, the details will come out in the secondary legislation when we see it. So gateway 2, it's a full building control submission, and that must demonstrate how the proposals will comply with the building regulations requirements. So this relates to higher risk buildings. And then along with it, it's not just that submission. It's a lot of process and strategies for making sure that when that design is built, that it will end up with a building that complies. So it's evidencing of compliance. Change management strategy. Change management will be a really significant thing. Every change, depending on the level and category, there's two categories of change, will need to go back and be reapproved. Some of them will be, you'll table them, and if there's no comments within a period of time, they'll wade through. Other ones you have to get formal approval for, the more significant ones. But everything needs change, very strong change management. Competence management strategy, competence across design, competence across build is really important. You need to be able to evidence that those people involved or competent have the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours to deliver what they need to. Then you've got the golden thread, which is all of the information, and I'll touch on that a bit more later, and then mandatory occurrence reporting and the arrangements of those. Between Gateway 2 and 3, those involved need to obviously comply with their duties, cooperate, coordinate, communicate, be competent and have the organizational capability, follow that change control procedure, robust record keeping, detailed maintenance of the golden thread. And I think, don't think of, or we'll talk about it later, but don't think about golden thread being something that, although the golden thread itself is something that'll only apply to high-risk buildings, that need to maintain assurance records, I think, will apply to everything. And then reporting of mandatory occurrence reports. Gateway 3 is that final process before you hand over the building, where you will need to, again, it's stop go, convince the regulator that that building is safe to occupy. Application requires quite a lot of documents, and then a completion certificate is issued once the building safety regulator's happy with what's been submitted to them. The golden thread applies right the way through from beginning to end. It's that body of evidence that something was built to comply with the building regulations and is safe, picking up on what was said before, and then is built to those standards, and again, as is safe. It's both the assurance records and it is the submission records. If you have a look at this, these are the various documents that are required to be submitted at the various stages, and all of this information needs to be included in the golden thread. So at the beginning, you start with a fire statement, gateway 2, building control submission, along with more detailed drawings and plans, competence declarations, construction control plan, including a schedule appointed person, construction management arrangements, competency strategy and records. And again, all of this needs to be maintained as that assurance record. Change control plan, mandatory occurrence reporting, design and build approach statement, and if you're going to go for partial completion strategy, fire and emergency file, building safety risk register, compliance approach statement, maintenance and management agreements, golden thread arrangements, planning statement, and then obviously your building control submission. And then in gateway 3, similar related documents. So a lot of information that's involved in the design and management of a high-risk building. This is going to be covered later, but for what I'm going to say next, I just need to make the point. There are significant liabilities coming down the line. The maximum penalty for building regulation failure will change. And don't forget, we've got now clear duty holders. It's not the person doing the work. There will be clear duty holders. You will be a designer, you'll be a principal designer, you'll be a client. You will be a duty holder, and therefore penalties for failure are significant. The time limit for starting a prosecution has been or will be removed when that part of the act is enacted, and the time limit for notices will move. This is significant. This is all, fortunately, legislation that will start and go forward, but it will apply. And then on top of that, personal liability, similar to the Health and Safety at Work Act, where the offence is committed with the consent, connivance, etc., of a director, manager, secretary, or a similar officer, they, as well as the body corporate, can be found guilty of that offence. So this is really, really significant. This applies to all building work to which the building regulations apply. This is not high-risk buildings. This is an attempt to try to demonstrate what you need to do to verify. So there's a bit on the left which is design, and then that loops into the bit on the right is construction. And if you see on the side, I put digital assurance record, non-HRB, and golden thread HRB. So within that assurance, the company has organizational capability. The contractor has the skills, knowledge, experience. The product is selected. You're going to use it. It was intended, and you need to verify that it's compatible with other products. You identify and install the maintenance requirements and verify it can be used and safely maintained as you intended. You then specify that product, and of course, all of that product compliance evidence needs to go into digital assurance record or golden thread. You prepare drawings, and it's really important that if somebody is going to make sure something is built in accordance with the regulations, that what you draw allows them to do so. And if you're going to pass on that detail, you need to make sure that you identify who's going to provide that detail and what level of competence they need to have to be able to provide that detail, so the contractor can provide the assurance. And then if the contractor chooses to do something else, it all goes back to the beginning. Through the construction, and I'm aware that there are contractors, Wilmot Dixon are already doing this relating to fire safety, and I think there are others too, I just happen to know they are, where they're providing this evidence relating to fire safety, and they can demonstrate that what was specified was what was procured, what was delivered on site. and they can check the competence of the organizational capability of their contractor, skills, knowledge, experience of their installer. They then will have the drawings because they were prepared by the designer to know what to install, what it needs to look like, so they can make sure that they can install in accordance with that design. Then on top of that, you have an assurance process to make sure that happens. And then of course you have the maintenance information that was provided with the design, which allows the O&Ms to prepare. And then on it goes into occupation. This is part of some work that's been done to try to work out all of the components of a golden thread. And this is just a snapshot of a piece of work, but you can see for every item, there will be assurance against every item. And if you want to think about what the golden thread is, it's really both of those pieces. It's the gateway submission documents interwoven with that assurance record. And finally, really, it's just looking at the issues and where to focus. Cooperation is key. Failure really can occur at the interfaces. It's at interfaces where you design something and then it goes on to a contractor's design proportion, or there is a sub-consultant providing design. And it's making sure that those assurance records continue. There's no gaps in that. Certainly with relating to a high-risk building, you will absolutely need to make sure that that continuity of record information and across the design responsibility transfer. Where there are interfaces, you need to be really sure that you've accurately worked out what you've done, where you are, what needs to be done, what competence is needed next to detail the next bit. Inspection, where inspection is required, particularly relating to structural engineering, have you made sure the principal contractor via the principal designer is aware of the need to inspect, particularly where that should be an engineer and where it could be somebody else, what the competence is required of somebody to ensure that. The requirements for evidence really comes in two ways. One is to make sure that everybody in that chain, in that golden thread, understand what was designed, why it was designed, and what they need to check. And the second bit is to provide defense because the liability is significant, carries on down the line.